Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today I'm just gonna kind of go through a list of um, reasons why Donald Trump kind of won the election, kind of breaking it down in kind of just quick bullet point type structure format, what have you, right? So, a lot of people are going to say one thing about why they voted for Trump or whatnot, but really Donald Trump to me is just kind of a reactionary movement, or MAGA is a reactionary movement, right? So, regardless, a lot of people kind of fell for conspiracy theories, something I like to call third eye politics. I think COVID, played a big role. The resurgence of kind of like Christian doomsday, uh, beliefs, the Israel versus Palestine situation. So there's going to be quite a bit of stuff I'm going to talk about. But, I think Democrats didn't really stand a chance because they kind of lost the psychological war that's been going on, that's been highly favoring Republicans. And so I'm just going to go through this list, right? So, like conspiracy theory culture, right? So we got QAnon, Alex Jones, InfoWars, Jay Dyer, who's kind of like this orthodox Christian convert who kind of always talks about conspiracy theories, and he kind of knows Alex Jones and things of that nature, right? Then David Icke, we know him, lizard people. There's a lot of conspiracy theory culture around these days. It's always been there, but it just seems more pronounced than ever before. And because conspiracy theories get you not believing institutions, it's easy for right wing politics to kind of push conspiracies to get people to kind of hate their own government, you know. So to go on, we have like the CIA is responsible for everything culture, right? And you see this on both the left and the right to a certain extent, but there's other intelligence agencies on the planet, but the CIA always gets the blame for everything, right? And therefore, it's just more of that kind of distrust of America. Fluoride in the water, makes you dumb, beliefs. There's people who believe that, and I've seen stuff on Instagram where people are happy that RFK Jr. is going to be the head of the Department of Health and Human Services because supposedly fluoride calcifies your pineal gland or something, which therefore disconnects you from the spiritual realm. I mean, like this is like a lot of people. Some people believe this stuff, right? Um, there's a lot of UFOlogy, so the science and culture around UFOs, and you've noticed that like Donald Trump is always kind of flirting with like, oh, I'm going to release the UFO papers and all this type of stuff, right? Or you'll notice on a lot of like the comedian Joe Rogan adjacent podcasts, they always kind of bring on these UFO people, always talking about ancient alien type stuff, right? Because it kind of that type of stuff um, kind of has the psychological effect of getting you to disbelieve in a linear reality. In other words, that history is a lie, right? So if you hate your modern life, maybe the past was more of a fantastical place with all these fantastical, mysteries that are waiting to be just unearthed, right? Um, we have, for example, like history is basically a lie culture with people like Graham Hancock, I think that's his name, and who's like that archaeologist. Some people call him a pseudo archaeologist who kind of believes that like the pyramids are older than what they are, and it's just Atlantis type stuff, right? Which is interesting because even though these things are kind of somewhat fun to play with, there is a history of right wing and fascist occultic themes. Searching for Atlantis, searching for Shangri-La, so, searching for the spear of destiny. Like the Nazi Party, right? They had the I think it's like the Enerby, which was like their occult archaeology department searching the world for like the origins of Aryans and stuff, right? So So that's another thing. Then of course, the New World Order, that's a big trope in conspiracy theory culture, and and that was very pronounced in like, especially like the 1980s, where you had a lot of like right wing militia culture, the Turner Diaries, which was like a neo-Nazi book, things of that nature. So like in other words, the United Nations is coming to take your guns, and this whole paranoid notion of a one world government sort of thing, which is ironic because like capitalism through free trade is probably the biggest reason why we have something even close to a global government at this point. Other conspiracies include global currency, which is so ironic to me because cryptocurrency is a global currency, but it's more right wing. That crypto bro culture is more right wing, and that's one of the interesting things to me is that I noticed that conservative culture likes kind of alleging that the left and progressives or Democrats or liberals are the conspiracy, when really it's kind of like some of the things they're pushing, like cryptocurrency and all these type of things, could be argued as a conspiracy. Um, Anyways, to keep going, so 666 mark of the beast theories, there's a lot of people who believe that Bill Gates is putting computer chips in people and all this type of stuff, right? Reptilian culture, like this whole notion that like we're being controlled by like a secret sect of reptiles. Like this stuff sounds crazy, but you have to realize that this stuff is very pronounced online. And I think that MAGA, the Make America Great Again movement, really kind of used conspiracy culture. In other words, let these people into our camp and let their conspiracies run wild, and we'll direct that conspiratorial energy at our enemies. Um, so to keep going, so we got conspiracies about the Bilderberg Group and the World Economic Forum and Davos and Bohemian Grove, right? With Alex Jones, famously allegedly sneaking into Bohemian Grove, right, where he saw the kind of weird Illuminati rituals with like the owl, symbology and all this type of stuff, right? So, which is interesting because like Alex Jones, despite being this conspiracy theory guy, is kind of like very close to like I would consider to be deep state government officials and like CIA type people or whatnot. And it makes me, and I've heard theories of like Alex Jones is kind of like a new reiteration of the John Birch Society, which was a very right wing organization after World War II, who were so right wing that they thought that Republicans like Eisenhower were actually being secretly controlled by communists. And they're one of the main progenitors behind like the New World Order conspiracies and all this type of stuff, right? So like because of like racial integration, these women's rights, you started noticing right wing people starting to say that, oh, it's all just a conspiracy, to like destroy Western civilization. That is like the proto foundation, the John Birch Society, of a lot of America's right wing thinking. Then also we have, the Great Replacement Theory and the Caligari plan, which are allegedly these conspiracies about how they're trying to replace white people, basically. And this Great Replacement Theory has been discussed by and promoted by people like Tucker Carlson on Fox News. You know what I'm saying? Like Fox News literally is talking, scaring white America into thinking that they're being replaced, right? And they blame this on, of course, the Jews, people like George Soros, you know, and like this whole notion that George Soros is controlling black people to attack white people and all these type of things, right? And like the same sort of conspiracy theory logic played a big role in the Nazi Party in Germany winning, because they were talking about how Jews were kidnapping kids and drinking their blood and all this type of stuff, which is basically QAnon with the whole adrenochrome stuff, right? Then we also have the unresolved and ongoing issues with Epstein, with the whole quote unquote Epstein isn't dead movement. But then also, since the Epstein situation wasn't resolved in the public's minds, they're already, fearful and not trusting of the government. Then you add on the P. Diddy situation. Interestingly, right during election season, in which is kind of a continuation of this kind of quote unquote Holly weird, you know, casting couch, child exploitation, Corey Feldman talking about how he was abused, sort of culture, you know, and that kind of feeds into conservative right wing, far right America's notions of the decadent bourgeoisie, liberal, modernist, urban types, right? Um, Whereas, the right wing likes to depict themselves as Volkish, VOLK. So like folk of the people of the earth, blood and soil. So you start getting a lot of that kind of like almost back to Nazi kind of like proto psychology going on. And basically, instead of right wing people directing their energy ironically at rich people like Donald Trump, they want to direct it at, the artists, the people in Hollywood, things of that nature, because they pose a threat to particularly challenging the status quo, heteronormative standards, whiteness, things of that nature, right? Um, so there's a lot of that going on. So then that kind of feeds into my next bullet point of third eye politics. And third eye politics, we got like Tulsi Gabbard, who was a member of Hare Krishna sect. The Joe Rogan podcast with all of his guests like Graham Hancock. And Joe Rogan is kind of like this new wave psychonaut in the vein of a Timothy Leary culture. So the kind of, drop acid, burnout type stuff, right? And this also touches on Burning Man Festival, which also even touches on the UFO culture. So you're starting to see, even within right wing politics, there is a big section or gateways into fascist thinking through conspiracy theory and what I call third eye politics. And Donald Trump and his administration just absorbed this. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, I'm not a comic book person. I've never actually really watched any of the Avenger movies too much, but what is it, Thanos or whatever? The ring, little, what's the glove with the jewels or something? I mean, Donald Trump basically just, or his campaign people, they just realized, just take every single populist movement, no matter how fringe it is, put it into a pot, boil it, and sell it. Um, and I feel like progressives, like in your vein of like your Bernie Sanders, your Majority Reports, things of that nature, they don't really mess with conspiracy theory. Whereas the right is totally unrepentant in pushing conspiracy theories. And I think that that caused people's brains to break, and notably because of my next bullet point, COVID. So there was a lot of anger around the shutdowns, how it was handled, angry over about people needing to restructure their lives around schooling their kids at home, anger over the economic impact in many communities, right? Many mom and pop shops. Imagine being from like Long Island and there's like a pizza place or something and it gets closed down. People are angry that these things are going away. And a lot of people are able thought that COVID was kind of like this conspiracy theory, with the lab leak theory, and like they were kind of pushing this notion that it was all planned to kind of like use shock doctrine for the corporations to basically just take up things. And to a certain extent, that was a reality of COVID. Unfortunately, the rich got richer at the expense of the people, in which governments created money and stimulus to bail out the businesses. um, However, however, I don't think it was like you're playing with, I'm playing with dangerous territory here on YouTube, but maybe I should just keep going so I don't get, blocked or reprimanded. But you know what I'm saying. But a lot of people unfortunately really passed away, from that disease. So, despite the conspiracy theories around it, whether you believe the origins or whatever, a lot of people died from it still. So, but anyways, um, So then, this is like, remember there was all the skepticism about the lethality of it. So there's the whole herd immunity camp versus the vaccination camp. There's just a general sense of fear. I think COVID really broke people's brains and exposed them into more of the conspiracy theory culture I said above. And then further, we can go to Christians and doomsday. So, a big part of MAGA is the Christian right and evangelical movement. And, there's this whole notion of the end times, the rapture, the antichrist. There's dominion ideology, which is essentially there is no separation between church and state. They want a Christian nationalist state. You have Zionism, of course, this belief in Israel, kind of like a manifest destiny for Christians to kind of like restore Israel to its glory in the hopes that, Jesus Christ comes back. You have the effects of the Left Behind series by, I think it's like Tim LaHaye, I think is his name. So this whole notion of like it's a book series, and I think they made them into movies about like the rapture and how the worthy Christians just vanished and went to heaven, and everybody else just kind of left on earth to kind of like deal with their tribulations and stuff. But then even though a lot of that is like kind of your WASP Anglo-Saxon Protestantism and conspiracy culture, which is very interesting because a lot of our American Protestantism is based in Puritanism, the same sort of culture who literally burned women alive. Um, but then we also have the Catholic right wing with groups like Opus Dei, Leo Leonard. But then we also have this growing Orthodox movement in America, which to me is actually a backdoor into the United States for Russian propaganda because Moscow is kind of seen as like the Vatican of, Orthodoxy basically. Even though there's different, nationality Orthodox segments, like Greek Orthodox is a little bit different than Russian Orthodox, or now there's a difference between Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox because of the war. But Christianity, conspiracy theories, COVID, all these things created like a toxic bomb that just helped Donald Trump, and there was no real stopping that, besides maybe Democrats being maybe, even though management of that crisis wasn't all on Democrats, Democrats kind of got the blame perceptually speaking because Democrats are more government managerial, etc. Um, but then also bleeding from the Christian stuff, right? Then we get Israel. So, of course, Israeli Defense Force versus Hamas, with many Palestinian civilian casualties in Gaza and Israeli hostages, disputed settlements by Israeli settlers. Trump acknowledged the capital of Israel as being Jerusalem rather than being shared between the Israelis and the Palestinians. You have a lot of the Stop Anti-Semitism hashtags. There's this whole insinuating, being critical of Israel military actions means that you're anti-Semitic. So that makes people angry. Then they actually start becoming anti-Semitic and conspiratorial. Um, you know, there's Israel's conflicts and disputes with the United Nations because the UN has condemned the treatment of Palestinians. Therefore, maybe even Israel intelligence or operatives are pushing anti-United Nations rhetoric because the United Nations is kind of holding them accountable for what's going on over there in their country. So and that even can bleed into conspiracy theory because now you got Christians who are supporting Israel and they need it for the rapture, and then you have maybe even Israeli operatives pushing anti-UN stuff, and they're pushing the New World Order conspiracies because they don't want the UN to regulate them or create resolutions that condemn their settlements, etc. You know, and then we also have Islam coming up next. So there's a lot of fear about Islam taking over the West, right? You see it in England, continental Europe, United States, etc., Australia. This fear of Muslims coming in and using their voter power to potentially implement Sharia law. That's like the fear and conspiracy theory, right? Um, but it's interesting because Not only do you have this nativist fear of Islam, you have many people of the Islamic faith who may actually stand up with Palestine, who have voting power. So like the Democrats were kind of in a screwed position because not only do they have to show how much they love Israel to keep up with the Republicans who are unrepentant in their love for Israel because of Christianity, not necessarily their love of Jewish people. Um, but Democrats also have to balance the growing Muslim population, where I think that Democrats sometimes, because they are a party of diversity, they think that diversity is always going to help them, when really there are these kind of internal vendettas and feuds. It's like, for example, if you're, let's just say, like a Muslim person from, let's just say, somewhere in Michigan or whatnot, and you're all about Gaza, that's going to pose an issue to if you're a Jewish person from Hollywood or Beverly Hills or wherever, or Brooklyn, whatever, Brighton Beach, Crown Heights, I don't know, somewhere in New York or whatever, that's going to pose a problem. So you lose voters on both ends because they are very adamant about their stance, right? And then also something that helped Trump was whether you believe it or not, because sure, I know that his daughter's married to a Jewish man with Jared Kushner, etc. But we're living in a world now where anti-Semitism is the worst I've ever seen in my life. But blaming all the world's issues on Jews for, quote unquote, liberal decadence or hating white people, which is crazy that comedians like Theo Vaughn even said that himself. So you have these very popular, comedian type podcasters even uh, talking and pushing anti-Semitic tropes, which is just dangerous and how scary it's been normalized you know, always pointing to Jews as being, responsible for the conspiracy. However, I'm disappointed actually because there are many right wing Jews out there who vote for Donald Trump despite the anti-Semitism of many of his followers. So it's like this weird bedfellow situation or whatnot. I think her name is like Ariane Wexler or something. Like but anyway, she's like some sort of like influencer on social media, and it's just interesting because like she's all about Donald Trump, and I believe she's Jewish, but it's like I just rarely hear these Republican Jewish people these days ever calling out racism or anti-Semitism where it actually comes from. Rather, they're always pointing to the college students in the pro Gaza people, but they're not. But they're totally fine being in bed with actual white supremacist Nazis, which I think is just very telling. You know what I'm saying? It's like the ultimate pick me situation or something. But it's just wild. But a big issue of why Donald Trump won, whether people want to admit it or not, is white anxiety. There's a lot of anger by white people about hearing about white privilege, just systemic racism. But then there's also this like fear of being a minority, which I think is kind of subjective, and because you know nobody can predict birth rates. You know what I'm saying? And whiteness is a construct that has changed over time. You know what I'm saying? So it's there, but there's a lot of fear, going on around like white identity politics. Then also, let's just be real, a lot of people are transphobic and homophobic, right? And that's a big part of why Donald Trump won. And all he had to do was say that I'm kicking trans people out of the military and they're not going to be in our bathrooms. That's all people really cared about. They don't care about tax code. They just care about this fear of a group of people who probably make up less than 1% of the entire population. Conservatives are pushing this belief that like trans people somehow discovered in the last couple of years that you can sneak into a bathroom and assault someone. Like if like this irrational fear of trans people, as if like you know, predators wouldn't have already been doing that or something if that were truly the case. But there's this whole notion of just like pushing fear around trans people. And I saw some of the Trump Vance commercials, and they were, basically just shaming trans people. In other words, you're voting for these people who they consider to be mentally ill. You know what I'm saying? Which is so ironic and interesting to me because there's trans influencers who support Donald Trump, like that Blair White person or something. Like she's a trans person, and see, I'm respectful enough to call her a her, but she's a Trump supporter. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like she says that yes, I know I'm messed up, but I'm still a Republican. So it's just very interesting. But and there's a fear of trans people in sports. There's all the J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter. She's super transphobic and like irrationally always talking about trans people. It's just very interesting that in most media depictions of trans people, they rarely try to show like a well-adjusted, normal trans person who just so happens to be trans. They always want to pick the hyperbolic, something that's going to what they think is going to disgust the public, right? And this is just old fashioned, predominantly male driven homophobia that I grew up with. We all grew up with it, so I can call it for what it is. That's what it is. you know Donald Trump and MAGA basically appeal to, I'm gonna be real, toxic masculinity. This kind of notion of like you have to constantly strut around to prove that you're not gay or something like that. you know and basically the Republicans and Jesse Waters and these people, they just kind of stoop to like middle school level, pull my finger bro stuff in order to like manipulate men into feeling like real men. But that's why masculinity is up next. There's this fear of seeming effeminate. You know, there's all these shaming terms like beta, cuck, simp, right? And there's a lot of dreams of the past, and there's also soldier of fortune culture, right? So a lot of military history, and which is interesting because I like military history, but military history online can easily bleed right wing, because what's the vast majority of military stuff online is about World War II, Nazi stuff, right? So then you start going down that rabbit hole. So just imagine being a young white male, being inculcated in this sort of right wing culture. You're into military stuff. You're going down every single rabbit hole, red pill, black pill space, and you just become this kind of like strange person living in these kind of online subcultures of like monarchism and like accelerationism and anarchism. And it's basically politics for like boys who think that Fight Club is still like a deep movie. And it's just interesting. But anyways, first person shooter games, Mike Rowe with this whole notion of college is dumb, which is so fascinating because like Republicans want to always talk about how men are suffering and women are doing better, but you literally have people like Mike Rowe telling men to drop out of college when it's proven that college degrees are typically a litmus test to make more money, because not everybody can do blue collar work. That's the thing about it. There's this whole notion of if you have, put it this way, if you have a town of 100 people, like let's say that like, for example, you can't have 10 plumbers in a town. You know what I'm saying? I'm only going to call one plumber, and I'm only going to call him when I really need it. There's this whole notion of just like, let's get men out of college, convince them that blue collar work is going to save the day. They become economically insecure and they become angry. And either they go join the military to go die for their country or something, which is what the military wants you to do, or they just become these angry, self medicating, chronically online people, you know, who need surrogate father figures like Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, Donald Trump, etc. And it's just that in itself just kind of seemed like a psyop to me with the whole Mike Rowe stuff, right? And that's what I'm saying. My next point was Joe Rogan is seen as a surrogate big brother figure, right? He hunts, he fishes, he thinks that wokeness sucks. He loves video games. He smokes weed. He's like a military grunt, but he's into UFC culture, and he's just kind of every single little snippet of just like a bro meathead male archetype who's able to just dominate a situation through the possibility of violence. Is kind of what it comes down to. And then there's the manosphere, right? So the manosphere, of course, it's kind of his own subculture, and it's basically just a misogynistic space that hates women. Not wanting a female president because a lot of men are so childish that if they see a woman happy, they think they've lost. Because the truth of the matter is, if Kamala Harris won, a lot of women were going to celebrate. And some of those women, let's just say they're feminists, some of those women have probably said things that have been very critical of men. So therefore, a lot of men have like internalized this criticism as hate, being hateful. Therefore, they don't want to see women succeed. You know what I'm saying? In other words, them voting for Donald Trump is kind of like them, slapping a woman basically and getting away with it, unfortunately. And I would say people just need to get over that childish mentality of seeing women celebrate. Let them have their time to shine, but then get over it, if it happens, whenever it happens, Because I know what it's like to be a young man and be a little insecure and all that type of stuff, but I just want to say, like, you grow out of it. You just grow out of it. You kind of get over your irrational fear of like what you consider to be like chaotic female sexuality and like their easier access to like fun and like situations that most men don't necessarily get until they get older, right? And this is a lot of that stuff, that the manosphere talks about. But rather than the people like Fresh and Fit in the manosphere telling men how I'm telling them just to get over it and like things get better, they actually tell men to become more toxic and to become, pushers of this sort of unfettered capitalist system that kind of metastasizes and leads to kind of glib superficiality, materialism, etc. You know, but there's a lot of like woman hatred on certain issues. There's MGTOWs who are men gone their own way. That's a subgenre. There's incels, involuntarily celibates. So basically, men who just can't get laid, and they're proud of that term. That's insane to me, But it's okay to not be get women all the time, Like there's nothing wrong with that, you know. Um, you know, Blaming women for hypergamy. In other words, this notion that women always are looking for something a little bit better, so they date upwards, even if, according to the manosphere, it's way out of their league. You know, there's a disdain for feminism, no fault divorce. Even men who think that women shouldn't even vote. So there's characters like Andrew Tate, Donovan Sharp, the Fresh and Fit podcast, and a figure named Rollo Tomasi, who I think wrote a series of books called The Rational Male. And Rollo Tomasi is fascinating because he has links to people like Stefan Molyneux, and Stefan Molyneux also has links to Joe Rogan. But Stefan Molyneux was actually listed on the Southern Poverty Law Center's like hate list or something for like creating like some weird cults of like racial IQ stuff. I don't. There's something weird going on there. But anyways, like I'm saying, like even there's like a couple degrees of separation from that, and then something I wrote here down below the manosphere is the frat boy wars. So you got Barstool Sports with David Portnoy. Let's just be real. It's about babes, beer, pizza. And, it's about like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. It's like for the guys, like I said, who like don't read the the criticism in Fight Club or like American Psycho or The Wolf of Wall Street. Rather, they just see white men doing whatever they want to and having fun. And this appeals to, and I'm not even trying to like point out like white people, but just men in general, right? So this appeals to like your college underclassmen demographic. So, for example, like a lot of, I think, men now, young boys, early college year students and stuff, they're being kind of told that like the past is better and that social justice in the left has robbed them of their rights and their destiny, right? That's what's kind of going on here, and I think the MAGA movement really fed into that through its web of social influencers. Um, you know, they want to go back to the time of Housewives and Don Draper from Mad Men Masculinity, right? This kind of pornified version, or not, this kind of like, not unrealistic, but this kind of, stoic view of masculinity. But then we also have immigrant assimilation. We have a lot of immigrants trying to fit into America, and this has always been the case, right? The Irish, the Italians, the Polish, the Jews, they were discriminated against, but now they're just white people. And I think a lot of other groups are aspiring to be that, right? For example, Indian Americans. Like, Indian Americans most likely still vote heavily Democrat. However, when you notice is that there's been very many prominent Indian Americans in Republican politics. Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, Nikki Haley, perfect example of kind of a person of Indian heritage who doesn't really speak about her Indian heritage. JD Vance's wife, Vivek Ramaswamy, this new Kash Patel guy, and all this, right? You're starting to notice a lot more Indian people kind of become on Republicans, right? And and I don't know why. I think it's because of this whole notion of meritocracy, and I think that's a lot in Asian culture, right? I worked hard for it. I studied hard for it. I deserve the fruits of my spoils and everything like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then at the same time, it kind of does, in a certain extent, if you're coming from a left wing perspective, it can kind of just totally disregard the actual systemic issues that have actually detrimentally affected certain groups who have a historicity, a true, in depth, almost genetic history tied to this country at this point. You know what I'm saying? Like African Americans, Native Americans, of course. You know what I'm saying? Like, in other words, many of these groups, like Indian Americans, Arab Americans, did not experience the treatment that black people experienced, but they were able to benefit from the post civil rights era. And even though they're coming from different countries and everything like that, where things may be very much worse, Pakistan, India, other countries where poverty is a very bad thing, you can't necessarily compare their country to our country because the fact is groups like African Americans are products of this country who are treated in a certain way and given a certain value. So even if you're an immigrant from a poor country coming over here, and to say you're not a black person, for example, there seems to be more of a tendency for people to swing down on black people to prove their worth as in order to fit as a part of the larger white superstructure of the United States. And you start to see, this is a lot of different groups. Mexican Americans, right? A lot of Mexican Americans voted for Trump because they don't want to be seen as the bad ones, right? Cuban Americans notoriously Republican because of the whole notion of like, Castro taking over, and just, it just became the culture of just South Florida Cuban American politics and the machine down there with people like Marco Rubio. Russian Americans, you know, this whole notion of them escaping communism, but then, now with, the United States and Russia still being at odds with each other, and Donald Trump seeming to be more, pacifist and soft on Russia, I wouldn't be surprised if many Russian Americans voted for Trump. And many Russian Americans are moving to like areas like Wisconsin and stuff like that. So it goes on. But then we also have subcultures. This is a big one. So anti-vaccination culture, vegan culture, which is not bad, but historically some fascist regimes have sort of emphasized clean eating as the basis for their revolts against modernity. In other words, it's very like almost kind of like homesteader culture that we're seeing now, right? If you look at it back at Nazi Germany, or any sort of fascist movements, there's always this notion of kind of like the peasant, you know, uh, in the field, right, going back to nature, milking cows, the era before pasteurization, which is why you're seeing all this kind of like raw milk stuff now, you know. So, vegan culture can be kind of exploited by reactionary movements. Um, so let me see here. But then, so vegan can be seen that way, but also this all meat diet is kind of seen as the antithesis of liberalism as well, because there's the whole stereotype of like, oh, you don't want to kill animals and all this type of stuff. So you have this reactionary movement where people eat nothing but animals, and they convince themselves that it's healthy when really they're almost kind of making a political decision at that point. Bitcoin Bros, that's a big one. The Wall Street Bets, who became famous because of the GameStop stuff, right? So you have a lot more younger people kind of getting involved in Robinhood trading and online trading and all this type of stuff, right? So they're being convinced that the past is better, right? Greed is good. Gordon Greco, Patrick Bateman, American Psycho. This kind of notion of kind of these fun Wall Street guys. I'm not saying that Patrick Bateman is fun at all, but you know what I'm saying? Like he appeared on the surface as this fun person, right? But me keep going. Trad wives, that's a big one. This whole notion of trad wives and biblical femininity. In other words, women convincing themselves that they need to be controlled by a man in order to find happiness, and that it's ordained by the Bible, right? And it's like a reaction, which is funny to me because I think that actually trad wives are kind of just like feminists who are basically just like using men by coddling their ego to like not work basically. But it's just like the men don't care just as long as like they're made to feel special or something. And then anyways, where I yeah, I'm just gonna keep going. Actually, I was gonna be like, no, you're going to work. But anyways, the Deus Vult movement was kind of like your Catholic right wing crusader wannabes, survivalists, raw milk drinkers, Orthodox Christian converts, which are like kind of this, like I said, Russian adjacent thing happening in America. Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys. But then also one interesting subculture that I think has had an effect on right wing politics is prison culture YouTubers, because they kind of mix this notion of hyper masculinity with also racial segregation storylines and also like extremely anti homophobic, anti LGBTQ storylines. So it's kind of like, street level hyper masculinity. And because a lot of men theoretically are suffering, let's just say that some of them are just a day away from prison themselves, is that they feel that like liberalism and progressivism are kind of like the softer, weaker options rather than the real nitty gritty rules of power options that prison is, essentially. Um, but then there's also psychological warfare. So Michael Flynn, former, I think, I forget, he's a general, but he did something for Trump. I forget. It's late, but he admitted to having a digital army. So he's literally paying people to just be trolls online. I don't think the left is doing that. You know. Anyways, there's also American, Russian, Alexander Dugin inspired. He's like this philosopher guy for Putin, and Israeli psyops, right? So you have this Michael Flynn army, you have Russian bots trying to spread misinformation, Israeli bots trying to spread disinformation. And it just seems like this is probably the biggest thing because like if you go on Instagram or TikTok, there's just these random pages, and they all seem like copy replica pages, and they're interacting with themselves to push the algorithm in their favor, but they're just basically just copy and paste burner accounts that push nothing but anti-democrat, anti-progressive, anti-right wing stuff all day. And Mark Zuckerberg has not learned his lesson from the Cambridge Analytica thing, and he just lets this happen because I think that even I think he probably is a big Trump supporter himself because it's about deregulation, it's about more power in his pocket. And then you have intersectional conflicts. So you have a lot more of these white versus black storylines with BLM and affirmative action and rejecting, this I think a lot of there's this whole notion of be proud to be racist. because that's the antithesis of political correctness, right? So you're starting to see this resurgence in racism, unfortunately. And a lot of issues: racism, police profiling, Confederate statues. But then there's also Hispanic versus Black, where Hispanics are trying to fit into the American dream, and sometimes that means swinging down on Black people as a means of differentiating themselves. In other words, they're on the quest to become model minorities. But then you also had, Black Asian unfortunate stuff, which is why they had the Stop Asian Hate campaign. Even though Black people got blamed for a lot of the Asian attacks, there was like a lot of racism and attacks by other groups of people as well on Asian people, particularly because of the COVID pandemic. And it's just like, not one group is all responsible for it, but unfortunately, the media kind of riles these things up. And you have men versus women, of course, straight people versus the LGBTQIA plus people. And I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to read all these, but the right wing in MAGA and all these people, they just have way more nonprofits and organizations who work in tandem with each other. Claremont Institute, Manhattan Institute, Opus Dei, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, Cato Institute, Atlas Network, the John Birch Society, Hillsdale College, Liberty University, the Charles Martel Society. Some of these are white supremacist organizations, by the way. VDARE, which is like a white only immigration type organization. Pioneer Fund. I mean, it goes on and on. And a lot of the trends in these groups are they're typically capitalist, libertarian, white supremacist organizations. It's just like it's just crazy. Um, More to come with that, I guess, on another video. But then there's also the anti-woke comedian revolt, right? So you have the Joe Rogan ecosystem, and all he does is just kind of he. I think he's way more he's way harder on Democrats than people like Republicans, because he's a rich guy now. You know what I'm saying? I think he's a rich guy, and I think that it's easy for him to say that the left has lost their mind or something. But at the same time, it's kind of like it's to me it's like the threat of like actual right wing fascism in our country outweighs a bunch of like college kids who listen to like Rage Against the Machine, who show up to like protest Milo Yiannopoulos or something. There's more of a threat from like neo Nazis trying to blow up electrical power stations than there are from like trans people. But Joe Rogan has played a big role in the right wing pivot of the American population. Um, Anyways, but he's also, like I said, he touches on comedy. Andrew Schultz, Tim Dillon, Tom Segura, that sort of ecosystem. Um, but also another reason why Donald Trump won was because of nostalgia. Notably the 1980s, which was this kind of like crux between modernism, postmodernism, hypercapitalism, but kind of mixed with this like veneer of 1950s conservatism under Reagan. So and Trump is kind of like a reinvigoration of that, right? Because you got to think, imagine being a high schooler and you were having the time of your life, driving your car, listening to your hair metal in 1980s, thinking about babes and beer and all this type of stuff, and watching Top Gun, and then now you're in your 50s or 60s, you have grandkids, and you wish for a better time and everything like that. Um, so, this resonates with like, boomers, Gen X, and young millennials and Zoomers. For example, like cold wave music, vaporwave music, like those are actually kind of very nostalgic. They're very almost like 1980s, neon. And the alt right uses a lot of that music, even though those genres of music aren't explicitly or mostly they're not like bad racist genres or something, but they do just invoke a sense of nostalgia. Um, so a rise in racial segregation as good rhetoric. So unfortunately, there's white separatists like Jared Taylor, Richard Spencer, Patriot Front, the Aryan Nations, but unfortunately, You also have black separatist and nationalist groups who who kind of slithered from up under the rocks they came from because of the Black Lives Matters movement. So Black Lives Matters wasn't like some racist organization, but a lot of figures like Umar Johnson and all these type of people, the very kind of they came they basically use everybody's anger and being aware and kind of being more woke to kind of come in and insert his kind of like Afro-fascism is what I call it. He talks about like saving black women, but really he just wants to have like five. He wants like polygamy or something. In other words, is like his whole notion of like saving black women is actually coming from like a patriarchal standpoint, um, more so of anything, in my personal opinion. But but a lot of white supremacists will quote Umar Johnson. See, they're segregating. We need to segregate, type of stuff, right? But then to skip down, there's also hate groups. So Patriot Front, Boogaloo Boys, who've actually like killed law enforcement, Three Percenters, Proud Boys, the Michigan Militia, Hell's Angels. Remember when the Hell's Angels were supposedly going to Colorado to like help kick immigrants out of like apartments because they were taking over the apartments, but it was like a BS story made up by the landlord who just like didn't want to do like repairs or something. He had to like make up this like big story about like how like his apartment was being taken over, and like Fox News ran with the story or something. Just weird stuff, right? But then just neo-Nazi groups, just run-of-the-mill neo-Nazi groups, and that feeds into right-wing influencers. And I want to say that the left they have what they call bread tube for like the left-wing commentators, um, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of collaboration between them. And if it is, it's kind of a rarity. When I think it needs to be more frequent. But there's just plenty of right wing influencers who supported Donald Trump. Nick Fuentes, Nazi, haven't Matt Walsh, John Doyle, Lily Gaddis, the N-word trad wife from South Carolina lady, the Red Elephant, the American Justice Warrior, who's all about police and like trying to prove that justifying cops are like the saviors of the world and everything. Tim Pool, who claims to be a liberal, but he's kind of sinister because like I think he means like in a classical sense, so he's actually a conservative, but he can just use linguistic shell games to say he's liberal, insinuating that he's a progressive when he's not. Steven Crowder, Jordan Peterson, Fresh Fit Podcast, Valuetainment with Patrick Bet David, Tucker Carlson, who's like obsessed with Russia, who's this at this point. But then you also unfortunately have migrant murder scares. Undocumented immigrants have killed people in our country, and that pissed a lot of people off. I wouldn't be surprised if the Laken Riley situation helped Donald Trump win in Georgia. I mean, Georgia always typically votes for Republican presidents, but being from Georgia and just knowing that like something like that would easily just instantly tip the scale of an election down there. But Laken Riley in Georgia, Molly Tibbetts in Iowa, Samantha Daly in West Virginia, Medley Waldecker in Virginia, Rachel Moore in Maryland, all these women were killed by illegal immigrants. So, and that's one of the things that sometimes the left comes off as dismissive of these facts. Like sure, the vast majority of immigrants, migrants are probably good people looking for a better life, but the left often doesn't come off as like really trying to defend people when crime is actually happening to them, and I think that really pissed a lot of people off. Um, then also, lastly, or two more points: conservative feminists and anti-feminists and TERF, so trans exclusionary radical feminists. So like let's be real, a lot of women feel that they're being encroached upon by trans women. They think that from their perspective, they haven't had a female president yet. You know, they see themselves as they think that authentic or biological, what they consider to be authentic females have not had their time to shine, and they don't want to share with trans women. is what it comes down to. It's pettiness and fear, which is so interesting to me because it's like for feminism who push the notion that patriarchy is real and men have privilege, being a trans person and basically voluntarily giving up your male privilege to fit into the gender of female that you want to, in this case of trans women, you're literally giving up your privilege. So why would you not be accepted by them? You know what I'm saying? Like it's interesting. You're gonna try to convince me that patriarchy exists, which it does, but you have men giving up their patriarchal privilege to be the gender, particularly female, that they want, and you don't want to accept them. That's why turfs just don't make a lot of sense to me. But that's just me, or probably other people. But I'm just here talking to myself. So, J.K. Rowling, Nancy Grace, who's kind of like this Karen figure, I'm starting to think. She kind of reminds me of like the white woman from the movie Rosewood, which is like a good movie. I think by John Singleton, guy who did Boys in the Hood. It was just blah, been a long time. But Rosewood, good movie, has Ving Rhames in it, and it's about a small black community in Florida who's actually attacked by a gang of white rioters, and it's based on a true story. But the riot was caused by a white woman who claimed that she was assaulted by a black man when it was actually a white man. And the Klan and all these like vigilantes went out and started hurting black people. But Nancy Grace gives me these kind of vibes or something. Like she's like I got attacked or something type vibes or something in order to get people to be like we got to go send out the mob to go protect her, go get the rope. And then you got racial scandals, George Floyd versus Derek Chauvin, and a lot of people are still pissed off at that. And I truly believe that that's had an effect on how people are reacting to the Daniel Penny, Jordan Neely situation. Because they think that Derek Chauvin shouldn't be in jail, therefore they're celebrating in this kind of racial tit for tat sort of game scoring that they're trying to keep um, going on, which is interesting that a lot of these people playing these games, the same ones trying to say that all lives matters and we should get over race, when really they're keeping tabs about how their group is actually quote unquote winning or being avenged or something in the larger culture war. Um, we also, of course, had Kyle Rittenhouse with the BLM protest, and I put riots because even though I support Black Lives Matters and most of the protesters were peaceful, unfortunately, you had jerks out there. I don't think it wasn't sanctioned by BLM or anything. They didn't say. I don't think they gave edicts saying go break stuff or whatever. But unfortunately, anytime you have these type of riots, you have looters and people like that. But I think a lot of people try to use those incidents to undermine the overall movement of BLM because they didn't want to deal with it. They don't want to have to deal with reforming police and the criminal justice system and talking about systemic racism. They don't want to talk about those things. Which is another reason why Donald Trump won. It's kind of la la la. This is not happening. I don't care. I want to just go back to square jawed white quarterbacks winning Super Bowls and where the heroes of the movie and you know F yeah, America rules. It's just this notion. I think America is just tired, and Democrats and progressives, bless their hearts, I don't think they're bad or anything. They just have a harder job than Republicans because Democrats actually have to balance a coalition of different groups. Whereas, let's just be real, the Republican Party, traditionally speaking, is monolithic. It's typically white male patriarch. And they don't need to really think outside the box. And they're always going to basically just be replicas and lock and step with each other. You know what I'm saying? They're going to be uniform. Democrats kind of have a hard job of balancing and constantly negotiating between the unions and the corporate management, negotiating between white, black, whatever, negotiating between religious people and more secular people, particularly around issues like abortion. It's just harder to be a Democrat, which ironically makes it more democratic. But this election showed that I think the country is just over democratic thinking, and they want a very monolithic, I'm being told what to do by strong leaders sort of thinking. This is why people worship Elon Musk and all these type of people. They're vicariously living through these people, is what it really comes down to. But like I said, there's just so much going on. So in summary, conspiracy theory, third eye politics, COVID, Christian and doomsday theories, Israel, Islam, anti-Semitism, white anxiety, transphobia, and anti-LGBTQ plus, masculinity, the manosphere, the frat boy wars, immigrant assimilation, subcultures, psychological warfare, intersectional conflict, organizations and think tanks, anti woke comedian revolts, nostalgia, a rise in racial segregation as good rhetoric, hate groups, right wing influencers, migrant murders, conservative feminist, anti feminist, and trans exclusionary radical feminists, and racial scandals. So a lot of these things all help Donald Trump win, and so therefore I think that progressives, the left, Democrats, liberals need to study this and not necessarily emulate it, but create an alternative for it. You know what I'm saying? But sometimes you have to speak to people where they are. You know what I'm saying? Like some of the biggest conspiracies are right wing conspiracies. You know what I'm saying? Michael Flynn literally knows John K. Singlob. John K. Singlob is one of the founders of the CIA. He was stationed in Laos. He managed the secret war for Henry Kissinger and the CIA, and that was right in the heart of the Golden Triangle where heroin was grown. He also trained the Mujahideen, where heroin is grown in Afghanistan. He also was involved in Iran Contra, where cocaine is from or was smuggled through. Like how is that not a conspiracy? You know what I'm saying? Donald Trump is a few degrees of separation away from people involved in Iran Contra and Jeffrey Epstein. But the left just doesn't do a good job of explaining this. And I think they need to do a better job of hammering that in, that the real deep state is right wing, is not social justice warriors in the deep state. It's these right wing, old, boomer, CIA, DC Beltway operatives who have almost a zealous, rabid, sometimes Christian doomsday devotion to Republican politics because they were indoctrinated with the whole evil empire, communist stuff, right? In Russia, in the communism, it was bad. But at the end of the day, these people just don't want to give the Cold War up. And because they didn't get their war with Russia, even though they could have it now, but they don't want it now because Russia is a white Christian country and they realize they need to be allies with them, even though they're totally fine bombing brown people in the Middle East or Asian people in China or something, you know. But regardless, it's like I think that the left just does a horrible job of just like playing this game. You know what I'm saying? Like, and for example, like Elon Musk is an immigrant. Why is this guy who wasn't born here coming here just because he has money trying to privatize Social Security? Like, how dare you? Like, go back to South Africa, bro. Like, South Africa has problems, major problems. Why are you not helping South Africa? Why are you over here? If you're such an OG, you know what I'm saying? Like such a world savior or something. Like they have problems over there. That's the country you were born in, and you're just over here, just jerking around and just yeah, like it's frustrating, that this unelected person can just sit here and try to like cut our grandparents' social security. Like go back to your country. If you, I'm just talk the way how sometimes these Trump supporters talk to us or other people. You know what I'm saying? And then they'll be like, oh wow, maybe you're right. But anyways, I'm just gonna wrap it up. I mean, it's been kind of it was kind of a long one, but kind of more. I tried to flow through it as quickly as I could. So with that being said, I'm just gonna wrap it up and thank you for your time. And like I said, I think the left just needs to hit the drawing board, but I think it's possible. But there needs to be more cross collaboration between content creators. B, you have to get on this conspiracy theory game. But left wing conspiracy theories are probably going to be way more factual and less superstitious than right wing conspiracy theories. Um, and yeah, just more to come, I guess, as far as ideas. But thank you for your time and peace out. All right, bye.